Today, I'm going to talk on poets and poetry of the world wars in English literature. We all know that this First World War fought between 1914 and 1918, and we'll talk about the poets who wrote poetry during this period. England was the one of those countries who came or entered in this war from the beginning, that is from 1914. And when this war came to England, this inspired poets. And out of this inspiration, they started writing poetry regarding war. We can find feelings of patriotism, nationalism, and heroism in their poetry. Okay, at the beginning, and the idealistic or romantic view of war, it was in their poetry. But very soon, this view was changed because of the real and sad experiences in war, because more than 4 lakh English young soldiers died in a single battle, that is the Battle of Somme, and lakhs of people were killed all over Europe. And that was not the picture with only English soldiers, it was all over the Europe. Dream of England means earlier it was thought that England, if there is a heaven, then that must be like an England. And this dream or this image of England as a paradise was shattered because of this First World War. So the poets of the First World War, they wrote in favor as well as against the war. We can have this picture of Battle of Somme, which was fought in 1916, where more than 4 lakh English soldiers died. Features of this poetry: we know that these people were not artists, and they did not have any group, or they did not have any set of ideas to write about. They were common soldiers who expressed their views, their feelings through poetry, and therefore the language that they used for poetry, that was colloquial. It means the language that we use in day-to-day life. The second feature we can describe as they used less rules, and they used less meter or less traditions of poetry writing, because they were not a trained poet, or they were not professional poets. Okay, they were simple soldiers, and therefore they did not use they did not follow strict rules or strict meter or traditions of poetry. Another feature we can say that we can find heroism, patriotism, or nationalism in their writing or in their poetry. Next, at the same time, we can find the description of horror of war. We can find the psychological trauma or cell shock neurosis in their poetry. When a person gets trauma, especially emotional or psychological, that person becomes mentally, um, what you can say, abnormal. Okay, and the rest life becomes abnormal. We can call him a kind of mad person. Okay, he is not totally mad, but he behaves something like lunatic. So that's kind of experiences this soldier faced in war, and therefore they also expressed those feelings in their war, in their poetry also. We can find also individuality in subject and style, as I have already earlier said, that these poets were not associated with a particular group of thoughts or particular association. So we can find variety in their writing, and definitely this variety represents their individuality, and this we can find both in their subject and in their style also. We can also find the writing of poetry against the hypocrisy of warmongers. Warmongers means those who sit in AC cabins and arrange wars with other nations. Okay, so though they advertise war is very good and we must fight or we must sacrifice ourselves for our nations, etc., but they never enter in war, or they never took weapons in their hand and went on border to fight with enemies. They only encourage other soldiers and ask them to fight, and they don't have anything with the loss of life of soldiers. Okay, so they also wrote against this kind of hypocrisy of the warmongers, and that is also one of the features of this poetry. Again, these poets also wrote about the problems of soldiers and ex-servicemen. Okay, the soldiers who are in duty, who are in service, what kind of problems they are facing, and at the same time the soldiers who are retired from that service and what they are doing now in society, how their life is disturbed if they are injured, if one of their limbs or more of them limbs are cut off or injured in army, and they are in that fighting, and that limb become in non-functional, then that kind of problems are also expressed in their poetry. Now, first of all, we will see the poets who wrote in favor of war. Okay, there are many more, but I have chosen only three of them. The most famous poet who wrote in favor of war is Rupert Brooke. Another is Greggs, and another is Nicole. Definitely, they were earlier soldiers, or they wrote at the beginning of the World War First, and therefore they wrote in favor of war. Patriotism, heroism, or nationalism we can find in their poetry. They praised the war traditionally. If we have seen the tradition of writing war poets, then we may need to go back to BC, or even before the time of our Mahabharata and Ramayana. Okay, from that time, the war is being praised. Okay, and the importance of war is being told through poetry, and therefore these earlier poets praised war traditionally. They also wished to die for their nation and they wanted to be martyr. Martyr means shahid. त्यांना पण शहीद म्हणून ओळखल्या जावं असं त्यांना वाटत होतं. They want to die for their nation, and to do something for their nation in the form of sacrificing their life. They faced horrible experiences in war. Okay, it was not like that they never come across such kind of horrible experiences in their life or in their war, but still they wrote, or they celebrated war, they praised the war. Okay, the first poet, that is Rupert Brooke, who was born in 1887 and died in 1915, just within a 1 year of starting this World War First, and he was died in war, that is in action, fighting with his enemies. He wrote many sonnets, especially, and all of them are war. One of his most famous sonnet, or the masterpiece of war poetry, is The Soldier, which he wrote in 1940. And here he expresses, or he shows his dedication towards his motherland, that is England. And he, at the beginning of that sonnet, he writes that if he dies abroad, then he will be buried there in that foreign country, and there, that place where he is buried, that place will become the place of England forever. And he wished to be martyr, and his wish was completed in the next year. Okay, that is in 1915 he became martyr. And at the end of his poem, he considers England as a heaven. Okay, if there is heaven, then that must be England, and there is no other heaven other than England. This is the sonnet. This is a Petrarchan sonnet, which you can divide in octaves sestet. At the beginning, the lines which I have made red, that shows that if he dies in foreign land, and he will be buried there, and that corner, that special part of that foreign country where his tomb or his grave will be, and there will be one stone showing his name and the nationality of that dead soldier. Okay, and that nationality or that part will remain forever of England, because that grave, that place where is that grave, will be useless for other work. And the last line of this sonnet shows that he is, or his country, that is England, is heaven. Now we will see the poets who had written against that war. Major poets of those writing against war were uh, Siegfried Sassoon, Isaac Rosenberg, and Wilfred Owen. Definitely they were the late soldier poets who wrote against war, or who were the first World War poets, but who started writing poetry after some months or after some years, and when after they have seen the horrible experiences or horrible incidents of that war. They faced traumatic or shell-shocking experiences in war. I had shown one picture of shell-shocking soldier, and that kind of experiences they expressed in their writing. They wrote about the life in military camp, attacks, slaughters, psychosis, or the soldiers of the problems of the soldiers of the ex-servicemen. The most famous poet, or perhaps the leading poet of this anti-war writing, is that Siegfried Sassoon, who did not die in that war, and he served as a soldier in there. His famous poem is Attack. Here he describes a tank attack on a trench or on a camp, soldier camp. He says that when that tank comes and attacks on that camp, at that time, some soldiers run away from that place to save their life because they are not conscious or they are not ready to counter attack or to face that attack. So they run away from that camp to save their life. But many of those soldiers die on the spot. And at the end of that poem, this Siegfried Sassoon, or the speaker of that poem, prays to Lord Jesus to stop this war at once. His another poem that shows anti-war feelings is The Deathbed. Here, he describes an injured soldier who is to die within a few moments or few hours. That soldier was given opium drugs to soothe his pain. That is a kind of painkiller, but that drugs also doesn't work for more time, and at the end that soldier dies. And here that one character is described called Death, and this Death says that I have chosen him and therefore he went. Okay, and I have chosen that soldier, and this Death has not chosen only one soldier, he has chosen lakhs of or crores of soldiers, and all of them had to go from this earth. On the next soldier poet, perhaps the most famous in the whole history of anti-war poetry, is that Wilfred Owen, who born in 1893 and died in 1918. In a very short span of life, he has to bid adieu to our world. He was an officer in army, and he died in fighting war with enemies in 1918. He was the greatest and perhaps the most famous poet of the war poetry. The theme of his poetry is war and pity of war. He influenced many poets, succeeding poets like W.H. Auden or Stephen Spender and many more. His famous poem is A Strange Meeting. Perhaps most of you have read this poem, and it is prescribed in our syllabus of MA second year, sorry, MA first year. Here, two soldiers meet in an imagined hell, and the first soldier is killed by the next one, and because of that continuous fighting, the second soldier is dead, and both of them meet in an hell, and there these two persons meet, and that meeting is strange. It is a kind of satire on warmongers. And if you see this poem, the first lines we can this shows that how these two soldiers died in war, and how they reached to an imagined hell. And the red line which I have made red, it is a kind of satire which makes us think whether we should continue war or whether we should try to settle our problems without fighting any war. Here, that dead soldier who is killed by other person, or the person who just entered hell, he speaks to that person, I am the enemy, you killed my friend. Yeah, here both the words are here, oxymoron. Enemy, he calls his new entered friend as enemy, and at the same time he calls him friend. It means that war is fought not because of the will of common people. It is only the will of those who are in power. They fought these wars just to keep their hold on their seat. They don't want to lose their power, and because of that, they arrange this kind of wars, and they spread a kind of nationalism among feeling of nationalism among the common people, and keep them away from real issues. And at the end, that two soldiers who are in fact enemies of each other, they say that let us sleep now. Okay, whatever happened, that happened. We cannot change now the situation which is going on earth. And here this poem ends. Another poem of him is Futility. Here one soldier is perhaps already dead or unconscious, and other soldiers tries to revive him, tries to make him conscious, but all their efforts are futile. Futility means in vain. Okay, their efforts are in vain. They could not save the life of that injured soldier. Even they keep that soldier in warm place. Okay, Europe is a cold region, and therefore they want warmth if they feel any problem. And that warm sunlight also becomes futile. That kind old sun is also helpless, and at the end of that poem, that soldier dies. His other poem is Insensibility. It expresses the sensibility of the war soldiers. This war affects the psychology of the soldiers and make them insensible. They only know to follow orders. They only know to trigger the button of that weapon and kill whatever or whatsoever comes before them, and they become insensible towards what will happen the person if you killed who is before you, what will happen with the family of that person. Okay, they become insensible for that. So that soldier loses their ability to feel. Next poet is who wrote against war is Isaac Rosenberg, who also died in war in action. He is Anglo-Jewish, and he died in 1918. His famous poem is Break of Day in the Trenches. Trench means camp, nothing else. And what happens there? One morning, this poet or speaker watches a rat who crosses the boundary of their region and goes in enemy's region and again comes back. Here, ironically, Rosenberg says that rat is a brave animal who can crosses the boundary and goes in enemy's camp or goes in enemy's region and also come back. But we soldiers or we human beings are coward. We don't have that daring to cross our boundary. And to conclusion, Robert Brooks, Greggs, and Nichols, these are the poets who wrote in favor of war. And Siegfried Sassoon, Isaac Rosenberg, Wilfred Owen, they were anti-war poets or they wrote against war. These poets of First World War were away from the experiments of modernism. We know that uh, this period was the period of modernism, and many writers brought modernism or innovations in writing, but these poets were away from that. Then they gave more importance to the subject uh, than the form of or the structure of the poetry. For them, their feelings were important, not the structure, and they expressed their feelings, boredom, fear of dread, traumatic experiences in war about their feelings in their writing. Now, the poets of the World War II. We all know that this World War started in 1939 and it was over in 1945. And we can see the pictures that aeroplanes were used in this war. And the second picture we can see of hydrogen bomb blasted on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This World War stopped with America's dropping bombs on two major cities in Japan in 1945. Then almost all the nations were involved in this war. In First World War, there were very few nations involved, but in Second World War, almost all the nations in the world were involved, and therefore it was more destructive than the First World War. And it is the cruelest event recorded in the history. Crores of people died, and many more were affected by this war. The poets of the First World War had no an early experience of war destruction, so we can find many poets writing in favor of war or they praised war, but All the new poet soldiers who joined or who served in the World War II, they were highly educated. They studied the history of World War First. They have seen the destruction of World War First. They also witnessed the sufferings of families of the dead soldiers, the injured ex-servicemen. For them, war was is equal to waste of human life or waste of resources, and they also were aware of the hypocrisy of the politicians who organize wars. So we can find no nationalism or heroism in their poetry. Among them, Sidney Keys is a major poet who died very early, even completing his 21st birthday. He died in war, and he was a major soldier poet of the World War II who wrote against war. He died in war in action with fighting or against fighting his enemies. He wrote against war. The central theme of his poetry is death, and his famous poem is War Poet. Here he writes about lunatic condition of a war injured soldier. Okay, this is the poem, very short poem written in colloquial language without following rhyme, rhythm, or that traditional features of poetry. I have made some lines bold. Uh, in the first two bold lines, he describes that when I grow sick and mad, mock me not, nor me chain. It means that soldier, even if he survives from war, there are very less chances of his remaining a normal person because he have faced so many horrible experiences in war, and because of that, there are more chances of imbalancing his mental condition. And if he becomes mad, then he prays or he asks others not to mock on him, not to chain him if he becomes mad in that war. And at the last, he says that though my face is a burned book and a waste town. Okay, now war is over, so don't consider me as a burned book or a waste town. Okay, respect me, though I remain in a normal condition or I may not remain in a normal condition. Next poet is Alan Lewis. He also wrote against war, and he died just 1 year before the end of war. And he is famous poet. He was killed in war fighting against enemies. He worked in India and Burma. Therefore, he is important for us. He wrote about fear of death. He wrote about also boredom or isolation of a soldier, the feelings of a soldier in camp or in war. He also wrote about people he met with, and death acts like a living person in his poems. The Soldier and My Living Mr. Death are his famous poems where he expresses his fear of death or the fear of a soldier about death. Another famous poets are Kenneth Douglas, who also died in war fighting against enemies. He worked in North America. His famous poem is Time Eating. And here he says that a snake can get its skin back, a lizard can get its tail back, but a soldier can never get his youth or his boyhood back. Once you become a soldier, you cannot enjoy all the things which a normal youth can enjoy. And when he retires from his service, when he comes back from his service, at that time, even after surviving, even after um, saving his life from enemies, he comes back. At that time, he finds that his boyhood has gone, and now he has become a middle-aged man. Roy Fuller, who served in Navy, Zerel, Dickey, etc., are other war poets, and most of them have written against war. So the poetry of World War II was not so famous because these poets were not artistic poets or professional poets. They just expressed their feelings, and therefore, and we know that media, they generally don't follow common people. They follow the people who are in power. and therefore they did not give proper weightage to the feelings of these poets, especially who wrote against war, and therefore they did not become famous at that time, though we read them now. Most of the poems were about death, boredom, injuries, psychological trauma, a loss of lives, problems, and problems of ex-servicemen and other things. Unlike World War First, means in World War First, we can find that uh, there were some poets who had written in favor of war, but in World War Second time, there were very few poets, and they wrote also very few poems in favor of war or praising war. They aimed to be personal and not public. Okay, their aim was to express their personal feeling. They did not write about what public wants. Okay, now we find that the trend is the thing which is being sold in market, that is tried to be produced. Okay, even the movies, that movies are produced, which is the taste of most of the people. But these people, these poets especially, they did not have to do anything with public opinion, public taste. They wanted to just express their own feelings, what they have faced in war. With this, I would like to conclude myself. For these notes, I have used these two resources. That is the book by B. Prasad, Background to the Study of English Literature, and one online source.